Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first morning session. I've never spoken at 9 a.m. before. I'm not going to make a habit of it, but I'll do it today. I'm James Matthew Wilson, for the 6 of you who don't already know me personally. And I'll have more to say about that in a few minutes. But before we do anything else, I would like to call Joshua Hren to the podium to offer the official Master of Fine Arts prayer.
Copyright Flannery O'Connor. Just want to make sure that the plagiarism accusations this year are pretty rough. So I just want to be careful. Let's pray in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. My dear God, I cannot love you the way I want to. You are the slim crescent of a moon that I see, and myself is the earth's shadow that keeps me from seeing all the moon. The crescent is very beautiful, and perhaps that is all one like I am should or could see. But what I am afraid of, dear God, is that my self-shadow will grow so large that it blocks the whole moon, that I will judge myself by the shadow that is nothing. I do not know you, God, because I am in the way. Please help me to push myself aside. I want very much to succeed in the world with what I do. I have prayed to you about this with my mind and my nerves on it, and strung my nerves into attention over it, and said, "Oh God, please, and I must, and please, please." I have not asked you, I feel, in the way that I ought. Let me henceforth ask you with resignation. That not being meant to be a slacking up in prayer, but a less frenzied kind, realizing that the frenzy is caused by an eagerness for what I want and not a spiritual trust. I do not wish to presume. I want to love. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
So once again, welcome, and there are still good seats available in the front row if anybody wants to make their way up. So once again, good morning. This is a School of the Catholic Imagination panel, a theme and discussion that is going to be interpreted both more and less literally by the speakers today. As some of you will know, we are all the faculty of the MFA program at the University of St. Thomas, the first ever wholly Catholic Master of Fine Arts program in the world. As I've had occasion to say many times, there are plenty of MFA programs at Catholic universities, plenty of Catholic writers who teach in MFA programs, but never has there been a curriculum that's inspired and inner-animated from the heart of the church. And that's what we've sought to become over these last 4 years. So, thinking of the Catholic imagination, we wanted to reflect on, you might say, the deliverances of our years working together to build up this program and to contemplate some of the results of it. So I'll be saying a few words this morning, treating the word school very literally. My colleagues will be speaking more or less figuratively in terms of the school of the Catholic or Christian imagination, and I'll introduce them all briefly now. To my immediate left is Joshua Hren, who is founder of Wiseblood Books, co-founder of the Honors College at Belmont Abbey, and co-founder of the MFA at the University of St. Thomas. He regularly publishes essays and poems in such journals as the Los Angeles Review of Books and First Things, America, National Review, and so on. Joshua is the author of 10 books, including the novels Blue Walls Falling Down and Infinite Regress, the short story collections This Our Exile and In the Wine Press, the book of poems Last Things, First Things, and Other Lost Causes, How to Read and Write Like a Catholic, Contemplative Realism, and forthcoming More Than a Matter of Taste, The Moral Imagination and the Spirit of Literature. Several of those books have been subjects of past ethics and culture panels, so we'll have to count on Joshua to get that next book out. So we have an
Those
idea
were
for
brutal
next year.
panels. They were takedowns. They were all just complete takedowns.
I would be remiss if I didn't mention that most of those books are for sale in the book room down the corridor. Next to Joshua is Brigid Pasulka. Brigid Pasulka's debut novel, A Long, Long Time Ago and Essentially True, won the 2010 PEN Hemingway Award, the Barnes & Noble Discover Award, and the Polish-American Historical Society Creative Arts Award. It was translated into 6 languages, including Polish. Her second novel, The Sun and Other Stars, was a Chicago Tribune Editor's Choice and an Indie Next Pick. Pasulka's short stories have been published in various literary journals. She lives with her husband and son, as all good people do, in the far north of Michigan. That got a reaction, huh?
Well, I'm glad you finished the sentence because it sounded like you were saying she lives with her husband and son, like all good people do,
Yes.
period.
Yes, that's called hiatus. Okay, so
I knew what I was going to say.
Ryan Wilson is the author of The Stranger World, winner of the Donald Justice Poetry Prize, of How to Think Like a Poet from Wiseblood Books, of Proteus Bound Selected Translations, and it occurs to me saying that he owes Joshua and I a great deal because we're respectively the publishers of those 2 books. But then he went out and freelanced, and so he also has recently published a new collection of poems in Ghostlight from Louisiana State. His work appears widely in periodicals such as Best American Poetry, 32 Poems, First Things, 5 Points, The Hopkins Review, Image, The New Criterion, and The Swanee Review. And then finally, to the far left there, is Katy Carl, who is writer-in-residence at the University of St. Thomas and is also the imprint editor at Word on Fire Luminor. She is the author of the fiction titles As Earth Without Water and Fragile Objects, both from Wiseblood Books, and she is a senior affiliate fellow at Penn's Program for Research on Religion and Urban Civil Society. Her essays have appeared in many outlets, including Ecstasis, Evangelization and Culture, Fair Forward, Public Discourse, Genealogies of Modernity, Mere Orthodoxy, Church Life Journal, and Front Porch Republic, among others. And just in case anybody doesn't know, I am the founding director of the MFA program at the University of St. Thomas, and while I won't name my books, I know that they're all available for sale, also in the book room. If you have your pennies, please head there directly after this session. So, as I said, I wanted to think about the question of a school of the Catholic imagination in a very literal sense because, much to my surprise, in middle age, I founded a school of the Catholic imagination with Joshua Hren. In that school, all of our students, as I'll say a few words about in a few minutes, take a course in the philosophy and theology of art and beauty, and in the course of their readings, they will encounter Jacques Maritain wonderful small book, Art and Scholasticism. And there an uncomfortable feeling will beset them. For in the chapter on Christianity and art, Jacques Maritain tells us directly, and this is a quote, "There is no school where one learns Christian art." A somewhat uncomfortable proposition, given what we're trying to do. What would it mean to ignore that declaration? And what would it mean to understand Maritain's words with that claim? In that chapter and elsewhere, Maritain is chiefly concerned first to reject the French academic traditions of the arts academies, which, as it happens, the Notre Dame Art Museum here has a wonderful exhibit and explanation of why that would be. The thought was that it taught method and mere repetition and therefore repressed the originalities of style that would emerge from the artist's hand. What he favored was, like a good Catholic, what you would find in the Middle Ages, which is a proper guild-like atmosphere, a workshop atmosphere, where one is not taught in the classroom so much as made to stand by the master and to both learn from his own practice and then to practice oneself under his, as his disciple until one becomes a master on one's own. It's a beautiful conception for a number of reasons, including that it emphasizes that practical knowledge is actually communicated by practice and by a shared practice, by a communal art and living out the life of one's art with one another. It also encourages a sense of the artist as being intrinsically close to his work. And those of you who know Alexander Pope's wonderful essay in criticism, perhaps the best line is where he tells us that some poets and critics, like spiders, live along the lines. That is to say, as close to their work as possible and without thought of anything but accomplishing that work. And this is what Meriton encourages, the artist to give himself wholly to his work in a kind of ascesis that is certainly in his mind and in the mind of his readers analogous to the asceticisms of the religious life. But he goes farther. Later in the chapter, he tells us, if you want to make Christian art, or art that will be worthy of the Christian religion, he says simply, be a Christian and make a good work. That's why our program's only 3 weeks long. We just tell them that we're done. Well, then that would leave me nothing to do, would it? So we've stretched things out a little bit longer. But what would it mean to live according to that prescription? I think that's what we were responding to when we started the program. All of our students begin in the workshop in two senses. First of all, we actually have courses called workshops, where you're workshopping your work. You're submitting it to the harsh and unforgiving judgment of your peers and treating one another as fellow artisans, committed not to sparing one another's feelings, but to the cultivation of the given work set before us until it realizes its full potential. But our students are also in the workshop in another sense. We begin as a sort of gateway into the whole program with what I call actually gateway courses, a term I borrow from my previous program. One called The Art and Metaphysics of Fiction, and the other The Craft of Poetry. And there, the students have their wrists slapped until they learn where you can place a trochee in a line of iambic pentameter. They learn plot and structure and how these things correlate to the structures of reality. So, in brief, we do emphasize that our students enter the workshop and master the chisel, the brush, as it were, as they come into our program. But to be a Christian and make a good work, depending on how you receive that sentence, may be harder than it sounds. And so we have tried to cultivate a curriculum that speaks to the inner truth of that sentence, which is that as much as you can do in forming the hand of the sculptor or the prosody of the poet, real education, real initiation and apprenticeship in the arts requires a complete kind of formation. A formation that is analogous to the formation that one would receive in religious life. It's about a forming of the whole person, of the whole soul, and not simply the passing on of rhetorical tools as if there were a method that could foolproof make you a good writer, or as if there were mere techniques that you could just repeat and safely become a fruitful and publishing writer. And so our coursework is designed, as I think all true things must be, in terms of a series of ascents, a series of pilgrimages from the workshop floor to the heights. In the poetry students, for instance, after having mastered the craft of poetry, in their second year, take a course called the Poetry Meditation, where they read the lyric poetic tradition in company with the great works of classical and medieval and early modern philosophy, theology, and spirituality that actually gave form to the Western lyric tradition. So they can see the anthropology behind the poem. You actually have to know something about what it means to be human in order to communicate in a poem, much to the chagrin of many of us. Joshua does something similar with his Art and Metaphysics of Fiction course, and also with his own genre seminars, one is on Dostoevsky. He needed a class all his own. And then on the art of the novel, which effectively I think is still a Bernonos class for those of you who love that man. And in each case, our students are being initiated into the concept of plot and character in terms of the spiritual drama of human existence. Those are the two main paths on which all of our students begin, but another series of ascents, or descents, depending on how you want to think about it, occur in the remaining portions of the curriculum, and I'll just mention these last two before turning things over to my colleagues. First, one of pure ascent. As I mentioned at the outset, all of our students take the philosophy of art and beauty, and there we begin, as Micheline Ode Flynn once said at the beginning, and so we start with Plato and move through the classical, medieval, and modern traditions to show why Plato was right. And this pathway of ascent is complemented by, at the center of things, Dionysius the Areopagite, whose own spirituality teaches us the pathway of aesthetic ascent that one must make from the natural discernment of the intelligibility of the world in his book, The Divine Names, to the entrance into mystery and even absurdity through his symbolic theology, and finally that aesthetics beyond all aesthetics, the study of the mystical theology. Learning where art falls silent is as important as learning when to speak. But there's another ascent that is, in a certain sense, a descent. In the second semester of their first year, all of our students take a seminar either in the European Catholic Revival or the Catholic Imagination in Modern American Literature. And in each case, they are learning from the last century of Catholic writers, and some just beyond that pale, about how to manifest the depths of the soul and the transcendence of the divine in language. But we believe that part of the initiation into the life of the artist is to gradually make all of the tradition your contemporary. And so while we want students to learn more recent writers first, precisely because it's easier for them to learn how the craft of writing from their more recent contemporaries, as they mature into their writing life, we want them to make the ancient world and the medieval world also as contemporary to them as was Flannery O'Connor or Christopher Beha. And so at the end of their second year, our students read Virgil's Aeneid, that great Aeneid of the spiritual life, Augustine's Confessions, and then finally Dante's Divine Comedy. In each of these practices, we hope that we're forming the whole person and leading all of our students on a pathway of ascent from the floor of the workshop to the divine heights. So thank you for your patience listening to these remarks. I will now turn things over to Joshua.
Thank you so much, James. And I'll begin by just noting that I never wanted to found or co-found an MFA program. In fact, I never wanted to be anywhere near an MFA program. And the reason for that is because my encounters with MFA culture was kind of led me to believe that MFAs are the worst of literary culture, in the sense that they're insular, kind of boosterism, cultivation of a climate that cannot stand genuine criticism. But maybe more important than all the other objections was that wherever I looked in MFA culture, there was a kind of presentism. I know that we talk a lot about the prejudices of sexism and racism, which are in their own ways and properly understood are very real threats. But presentism is oftentimes left off of the list, and this is a kind of prejudicial disposition that the supreme achievements of humankind are located in the last decade. And in most MFA programs, there is such an over-exaggerated emphasis on contemporary literature that the tradition is entirely forgotten. In fact, the idea that you would draw on insights from Dante, Dostoevsky, and in some programs, even Donna Tartt's 1990s novel is already sort of outdated. Now, I take very seriously St. John Henry Newman's insistence in his essay on the development of doctrine, which is a wonderful essay, especially for our time. I would recommend just that it's extraordinarily lucid in terms of providing categories by which we can determine when there is a genuine development versus a corruption that walks around under the name of a development. He says that when contemplating any change at all, we ought to exercise what he calls conservative action on the past. I will discuss the ways in which those who hold firmly to the permanent things can sometimes take refuge in a kind of false conservatism, however. So there's presentism on the one hand, and then there's a kind of false conservatism that becomes reactionary and nostalgic, as if all that is great and good has happened in the past only, and that anything new, anything happening now is by definition a part of some sort of societal decadence or decline. But can we live solely off the culture of the past, even if it is rich? This is a question that's haunted me forever. The Greeks live off of Homer for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Can't we live off of Dostoevsky and Dante for another century or another millennia? While we're talking about changes in sacred art or music or architecture, or certainly theology, the answer should be very different, with much more of an emphasis on this conservative action upon the past that Newman speaks of, in order to ward off a fleeting and vacuous novelty. However, in the same essay, St. John Henry Newman also insists that paradoxically, the shapes of enduring truths must sometimes change in order to remain the same. In a higher world, it is otherwise, but here below, to live is to change, and to be perfect is to have changed often. Again, I think that is a nice catchphrase, change in order to remain the same. But when you begin to try to think practically about what that looks like on the page or in any sort of genuine innovation or alteration, it's extraordinarily mysterious and difficult to know when you've done that without crossing the line into a kind of an abdication of the tradition and a fissure in the hermeneutic of continuity. Now, Philip Reeve, in his book, My Life Among the Death Works, which is a lovely morning read, I highly recommend over your burnt toast, he suggests that those who believe that the permanent truths have been definitively revealed once and for all, even those, they're dedicated to the proposition that the truths that have been permanently revealed require constant rereading and reapplication in light of the particulars of our moment. Taken in a misguided manner, this could lead to a cavalier presentism that would make solid things in order to sell them as relevant. Undertaken prudently, it is the essence of persuasion. Because we talk about this a lot in the program, but there's always a need to consider not just the work in and of itself in a sort of art for art's sake, aesthetical vacuum of aestheticism, but rather the work of art as it exists in the rhetorical situation within which it is arriving in readers' hands. So how does this play out, again, on a sort of more practical level in the classroom or in the curricula? That's what I'd like to next address. For one thing, we do what Flannery O'Connor did. Well, not quite exactly what she did. She read from St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae for 20 minutes every night, she said. I ask my students in the art of metaphysical fiction to do that just one time over the course of the semester. And for artists, right, who are sort of used to the falsifying romantic lie that philosophy and poetry must permanently remain two separate things, and that poets are over here and philosophers over here, like the sheep and the goats, one in heaven and one in hell. I won't tell you which. We correct that through a number of different ways in our program, but one of them in the Art of Metaphysics of Fiction class is called Meditations on Human Nature. It's an assignment where we take, again, very seriously St. John Henry Newman's idea that literature is largely a study of human nature. So Catholics, like any other creatures, can begin to master their subject by becoming astute students of other people and themselves. They can do this by making frank assessments of their own hearts and minds, not being deceived. Saint Simone Weil, I sometimes think of her as such, but Simone Weil says very persuasively that even if we don't read fiction, unless we're heroically truthful about ourselves and others, we tend to fictionalize our friends, we fictionalize our enemies, we fictionalize our own pasts, we fictionalize our futures in order to navigate reality. And so getting past that sort of illusory kind of fiction into a revelatory kind is difficult. But so we need to make these frank assessments of both our own hearts and minds. And also, it is the case that, as David Foster Wallace puts it in E Unibus Plurum, writers, artists are born oglers who like to spy on other people without anyone seeing them, without being spied on themselves. So that already leads us with two ways of studying human nature. One is just reading great literature, Shakespeare, Dante, Dostoevsky, Jane Austen. But then, on the other hand, in addition, there is spying on other people. So, surveying every conversation. I mean, we live in a voluntary surveillance state anyway, so I don't see what the big deal is. I don't know why you're all, I can feel people trembling out there, but just have a nice shot of vodka and calm down. So there's those two ways. But then, in addition, we do what Flannery did, which is consult the Summa Theologiae, and we read the Treatise on Human Acts. And this is a section of the Summa that's devoted to the relationship between intellect, will, and appetite, and how those three faculties of the human person kind of interrelate. And I firmly believe that, especially because we live in an age when human nature is a sort of the very idea of it is presented as passé. There is no stable, definitive human nature, right? It's just this completely plastic sort of thing whose terms and meaning and ends, if it has any ends, are constantly under construction. I think that this is something that our students deeply need, even if they already arrive in the classroom as devout Catholics. Okay, so then finally, I just like to give one other example of how the curriculum reflects this difficult good of a hermeneutic of continuity that takes seriously the past great works and also is attentive to those contemporary works which swim in that same stream. So in this year, in the Art of Metaphysics of Fiction, we're reading David Foster Wallace's large novel, Infinite Jest. And last year at this conference, I had discussed J.M. Coetzee's novel, The Pole, and the way in which that novel is a sort of secularized retelling of Dante's Divine Comedy. And especially in Coetzee's novel, there's a focus on a sort of re-instantiation of the moment in the Purgatorio where Dante has literally walked through fire to see Beatrice, his beloved, the image of God manifest for him. And when he finally meets her, she basically scolds him and tells him to confess all of his sins. So it's not exactly what readers were expecting. But after that moment, in Cantos 31 and 32, he goes on to drink of the rivers Lethe and Eunoe. So the river Lethe sort of helps him to purge his past memories, and Eunoe helps him to strengthen the memory of his good deeds. But he also is given the grace of beholding Beatrice. Now, Beatrice for Dante, as Eric Auerbach makes clear, is one of the first instances where instead of sort of the beatific vision being completely separated from sensuous sort of instantiations of that goodness, is a kind of wedding of the two. So Beatrice is a kind of a living sacrament of that beatific vision. In Infinite Jest, David Foster Wallace gives us several different sort of riffs or continuations of this notion. One is that in the middle of the novel, there is this film called Infinite Jest. And early on in the book, readers discover through this plot line that involves a Saudi Arabian assistant to an ear, nose, and throat doctor who is watching an unmarked cartridge one evening, that he, in watching whatever this thing is on the screen that they haven't yet discovered yet, pleasures himself. He receives so much pleasure from watching. Pleasures himself is the wrong way of putting it. It is a 9 o'clock. It is a 9 o'clock panel. He receives so much pleasure that he dies. And then when people come into the room to try to assist him, they too look at the screen and they die. So by the first instantiation of this, you have a whole room full of people who meant to help him who are all dead. The novel resists telling us what the contents of that film are for a while, and later on really only hint on it without giving it to us definitively. But what we do discover is that there's a character named Joel Van Dyne, who we meet when she's a drug addict who's trying to commit suicide in a bathroom. And she constantly goes around wearing a veil. We discover that part of the reason that she wears a veil is because she's part of a society called the Union of the Hideously and Improbably Deformed. But it's also the case that at one point, her mother, in a moment of fury towards her father, throws a jar of acid at her father, and her father ducks, and the acid falls on Joel Van Dyne's face. Now, there are different conflicting accounts of what happened. Joel Van Dyne is one of the most beautiful women who's ever lived, according to the novel. And one of the versions is that she became so hideous that she needs the veil to hide from everyone. The other one is that it actually accentuated her beauty to such an extent that to see her face, you would die, something like that, right? The pleasure is so overwhelming, the delight in the highest sense is so overwhelming. And so as the novel unfolds, Joel Van Dyne then very much becomes a kind of analog to Dante's Beatrice, because when Dante sees Beatrice at the top of Mount Purgatory in Cantos 31 and 32, she's wearing a veil. Now, when Dante approaches her, her handmaids cry out, "Turn, Beatrice, turn, turn, Beatrice, turn," right? Show him your mouth, they actually say. Show him your mouth. And so Beatrice shows him her mouth. And then in the beginning of the very next canto, they cry out, right, sort of, "He looks too long, he looks too long," right? He's, so there's this kind of tension between why is he being encouraged and solicited to look upon Beatrice in this way, but then he's scolded for doing so long. So I won't go into all of the ways in which Infinite Jest plays out this tension, but it very much does, because Joel Van Dyne becomes the love interest of one of the main characters of the novel, whose name is Don Gately, and he's the kind of Christ figure of the novel. He sacrifices himself in a street fight to save the life of a hideous man who we would say doesn't deserve to live because of all the horrible things, and we spend so much narrative time with him that we know he's a hideous man. And Don Gately, in sacrificing himself for this hideous man, is an emblem of Christ's sacrifice for all of us who certainly did not merit the salvation that we received. And this Christ figure of Don Gately ends up being saved by Joel Van Dyne, who ministers to him while he's bleeding to death on the street. And the rest of that plot thread really teases out the question of his ability to behold her rightly without sort of giving into lust versus a kind of erotic distortion to his perception of her, which is precisely the thing that I think Dante is exploring in those cantos that I addressed. So that's just one example, but I wanted to be very tangible and concrete in terms of the ways in which our program tries to wed ancient and new, right? To demonstrate that there are ways in which you can remain entirely sort of in debt to your influences, because, as Catholics, we need not be ashamed of our influences. Harold Bloom's sort of anxiety of influence, right? Like, you want to kill the father figure, which is the novelist who you love and owe the most to, you want to kill him. Well, maybe sometimes it can come to that. But our hope is that instead of wanting to kill him, you just love him so much. You love Dostoevsky so much. You love Flannery O'Connor so much that you don't want to just leave what they've given us as these sort of islands of nostalgia in the past, but to create this kind of living tradition of continuity. Thank you so much.
I also wanted nothing to do with MFA programs, but if you know James and Joshua, you know that you can't say no to them. They pulled us all in, and I was really struck listening to Joshua how we all have very similar ways of looking at not only writing but the process of writing. I'm not going to tell you anything new. I'm just going to tell you how the process of writing gets organized in my own mind. I'm going to start with the first time I thought about creating art. I actually came to writing late, so I studied sculpture in college, and one of my sculpture professors was a guy named Fumio Yoshimura, and he was famous not only for the product that he produced, which was wooden versions of everyday objects, so bicycles and typewriters made entirely out of wood, but he was also famous for the process, which was he only used Japanese hand tools, traditional hand tools. And he maintained that all good art is created out of equal components of tradition, those who came before us, and our contemporaries, those who are surrounding us, and our own imagination, and that this was the trinity of art. Now, I think that's a really good basis. Because we are who we are, we add a fourth component, and that's God. What does God want me to write? And I would say that these aren't components, but that these are ongoing conversations, because this is what we should strive for, is being, as writers and as people of faith, that we're striving toward a constant state of formation. And these are, I would say, what I have in my head as the practical work, the day-to-day work of a writer, and and the practical components in my mind of the program. And these aren't necessarily cauterized conversations. They're not taking place in isolation. One conversation generates another conversation, and then boomerangs back sometimes. But tradition, obviously, the way we access tradition is just through constant reading of what's come before you. And it's the old adage, every time you read something, you realize how much more you have to read. And I was taking notes while Joshua was talking about more things that I need to read. I'm going to go home from this conference, as I'm sure a lot of us are, just filled with essays and books to tackle. Conversations with our contemporaries. I do love this. I love being in solidarity with contemporary writers, people who are trying to do the same thing in this room. But I still feel like the best way to access is not through, if you're answering the question, what does Catholicism look like in fiction or poetry or film, or the best way to access that is to look at the tangible product that results, and not necessarily the conversations as you're getting to that product. Conversations with ourselves. I feel like this is crucial, and is being rapidly winnowed away, or has already been winnowed away. We live in a society where we live as individuals, where we really have squeezed most solitude out of our lives. Obviously through technology, also through busyness, also through pseudo busyness. And also, I think the overarching thing is the attitude that that solitude, being free from other people's thoughts, is a waste of time. So I think as writers, we need to actively get back to that space where we're having real internal monologues, not just, oh, I shouldn't have said something so stupid, or what am I going to make for dinner? But actual, like internal monologues with ourselves about real topics. And I think that's lost and needs to be regained in our daily lives. I'm in constant struggle to regain that. And then, our constant conversations with God, prayer, meditation, as Joshua was talking about, contemplation of God's creation. So, which is, we start with nature, but God's greatest creation is obviously man and his soul. And we need to constantly contemplate that. I think it's a popular, workshop or craft exercise to observe people from a distance, the Uber driver, the mom at the playground, the overhearing the conversations on the bus. But you're really not going to get to the soul and the deeper psychological elements of man unless you're examining the people. This is a scary thought as I'm saying it, but unless you're examining the people that you live with, unless you're examining the people who are close to you, unless you're examining your own soul, the reasons that you do what you do. So I think that's also crucial. And the other thing is, you're not trying to see them as you see them. You're trying to see them as God sees them. You have to see people as God sees them. You have to see yourself as God sees you. And that has to come through the fiction, in my case, fiction. And for me, all of these 4 conversations are just the opening stage of writing. So I think of writing in 2 stages, opening and closing. And these are in the opening stage when you're taking everything in. In the closing stage, I would argue, and I might be picking a fight here, but I feel like you need to shut down the first 3 conversations. I feel like somebody once told me, a non-writer, thank goodness, but said, you should come up with eternal plots and themes like Shakespeare. And this was, advice. Like, I don't need that in my head when I'm trying to write a story. It's an extreme example, but I think that you really need to shut off all those conversations with what came before us. I think you need to shut off the conversations of, what does New York want, and what are, those contemporaries doing, and, what are our Catholic contemporaries doing? I do think you need to shut off those conversations when you're alone with the paper. And I think you need to shut off your conversations with yourself. The idea is to completely empty yourself, and that you're just the conduit. These characters are going through you. The story is going through you. You're not drawing attention to yourself as the author. So the one conversation I think that remains when you're alone with the page is your conversation with God. Sometimes my students get tired of me asking, where is God in the story? I think that that's really the crucial question. Where is God in this story? And just like in real life, he doesn't have to be visible, but he needs to be present. If he's not present, then, what's the point? You're just writing about imaginary people. You're just the resounding gong, the clashing cymbals, your interior monologue with yourself. And I feel strongly that he should not only be present on the page in the product, but also in the process as it goes through. And I think we hesitate to ask for help in the writing process, just like we hesitate to ask for help in real life because we think, oh, this is, beneath God. This isn't worth God's attention. But They're they're very, very, I feel like if you're not going to ask for help with writing, what are you going to ask for help with sometimes? And, I have taken whole manuscripts to church with me, but it's, there are very concrete points in the process. Like, please God, please give me inspiration through you. Please God, pull me away from this despair that makes me think that what I'm doing isn't worthy. Please God, help me to be humble so that I can actually go through the editing process, put my pride aside, and kill some darlings here. Please God, help me to love the flawed person and help me to love the flawed character. Please God, help me to speak, the truth and have the fortitude to speak the truth, even if, that's not what the publisher wants to hear or the publishing industry wants to hear. Amen.
Morning, y'all. How's everybody doing? Good? Good. So they said all the good stuff. I'm basically going to be echoing, I think, versions of what my colleagues have said. First, however, I may slightly diverge. There's a lot of MFA bashing going on. And, I had the pleasure of doing 2 MFAs, as it happens, one at Johns Hopkins University and another at Boston University. And I had some wonderful teachers. I had the opportunity to study with poets like Dave Smith, Mary Jo Salter, Robert Pinsky, Derek Walcott. And they were helpful in their ways. And yet, to pivot back and agree with my colleagues, a great deal of my own formation as an artist was, as Dana said last night, unlearning. It was unlearning so much of what was just sort of in the water, in the air, in the culture at the MFA programs. And I suspect that everyone on the panel with me did a great deal of unlearning as well at some point, kind of tearing down and starting over at the beginning and figuring out how things work. So when I was invited summer a year and a half ago out to UST to give a guest lecture, I didn't know what to expect. The lecture was to do with translation. And so I gave an exercise that I often use because it's brief, attempting to translate Catullus Carmina 85. And I was absolutely blown away by the students and the level of learning that they brought to the program, the level of desire to learn that they brought to the program, and the humility. One of the things that's difficult in a lot of MFA programs is that things get very competitive, very catty. Everyone has a big ego, and at UST, I have yet to see any of that. There's just a desire to learn, and I'm reminded, the way Brigid was talking a moment ago about putting yourself aside. I'm reminded of St. Thomas Aquinas and his approach to disputatio, right? That it's not about me, it's not about the person I'm arguing with, it's about the truth. And we got to get our egos out of the way. So I've been very fortunate in winding up at UST in this program, which I admire very much. So what kinds of things are we talking about, right? I'm taking very literally the School of the Catholic Imagination. What kinds of things are we talking about? What are the kinds of things I talk about in class? Well, my twin, James Matthew Wilson, by the way, you cannot work as a poet at UST unless your last name is Wilson and one of your first 2 names is James. My middle name is James, so I was able to be... I would also point out that my twin is older than I am. I am the younger of the 2 twins. But as he said, right, we're talking on a particular level about things like trochees. So a thing I'm constantly telling my students is you can't put a trochee into the fourth foot of an iambic pentameter without a preceding caesura, because the ictus of the trochee will override the ictus of the preceding iamb, resulting in a tetrameter that has 2 anapestic substitutions in its last 2 feet. It sounds like I'm speaking a foreign language, right? It sounds like I'm from Mars, but this is the kind of level of detail to craft that we have to be able to go into. And it's a level of craft that nobody taught me. I had to teach myself by reading poetry across 7 languages going back a few thousand years, but especially in English and early modern English when they're figuring out metrics. And then into the 20th century, one of my favorite letters that I've ever read is a letter from the poet James Wright to John Crow Ransom. And it's a 3-page letter raving about just this substitution, the fourth foot trochee in an iambic line. This is circa 1960. And James Wright is blown away by the daring do of a poet who inserted a fourth foot trochee. That's the kind of nerd that I am. I get excited by that too. But it's not just the specific level of the line. There's also literary history. There's aesthetics. There's the ability to close read. And so James mentioned the foundations course where we do Virgil and Augustine and Dante, and I had a great time doing that last spring, teaching that class. I approached it with some trepidation because I'm also very much a Latin nerd, and I've always had to sort of hold back when addressing things of that nature. So I didn't know what to expect, but in the first meeting, we spent an hour and a half just close reading the first 8 lines of the Aeneid. And I thought, this is my cue to the students. They need to buckle up. We're going in depth, but I thought they might hate it. And it turns out, apparently everyone was writing to James and saying how much they loved it. That's exactly what they wanted, was to go into that kind of depth, right? And not just, at the level of the line, but in terms of context. So with Virgil, for instance, almost everyone knows, even if you don't know it's from Virgil, you know, omnia vincit amor, right? Love conquers all. That's from the 10th of his Eclogues, his first book. Most people don't know that Virgil keeps revising that same statement based on the verb vincere, to conquer. So in the Georgics, his second book, in the first of the 4 Georgics, he writes, labor omnia vicit. Changes it to the past tense. He says, labor conquered all. Labor improbus. Steady work, endurance, conquered all. Well, when we get to the Aeneid, we see a synthesis of these earlier books. In book 6 of the Aeneid, Anchises will say to Aeneas, vicit iter durum pietas. Piety conquered the difficult journey. And piety, pietas, for Virgil, is a blend of amor and labor. Aeneas is the child of Venus, goddess of love, and so is a figure of love himself. And of course, he has to endure great suffering and a long journey. In any case, I'm going off. I told you I was a Latin nerd. But the point is, right, that to understand the Aeneid, we have to understand some of the Eclogues and the Georgics. And what we're doing is getting a context, a literary history in the way that Joshua was talking about. But it's not simply literary history. It's thinking about how, as Aeneas carries forward Anchises in the Aeneid, we can carry forward our own mothers and fathers into the present moment. So that's the kind of thing that very few literary programs or MFAs are going to offer as well. We're reading, yes, Virgil and Dante and Augustine, but we're also reading Marie Howe and Franz Wright and Dana Gioia and Notre Dame's own Orlando Ricardo Menes, one of my favorite contemporaries, trying to synthesize, trying to bring everything together. So why don't most programs do the kind of thing that we're doing? Well, there's a long story, but I'll be brief in this. In the 1960s, the late 1960s, deconstruction came to America. Deconstructionism is rooted in the semiotics of Ferdinand de Saussure. And Saussure says that there is the signifier, the word, whereabout, to use Augustine's terms, and there's the signified, res, thing. And he says that there's no intrinsic relationship between those two. So deconstruction and the subsequent movements it spawned believed then language is entirely culturally constructed. And because there is no intrinsic meaning in words, what we're doing is basically being engaged in a perpetual power struggle. And so out of deconstruction, we get lots of theories that now dominate almost every literary program, creative writing or English across the country. And these programs approach language as a power struggle. It's all about who controls the signifiers. There is no way to know what is out beyond our words. So everything, if we have that view, everything in literature is about politics, or it's about the writer, because that's all that can be accessed, all that can be known. Our program would contradict that. And we would follow, I think generally, I don't want to speak for others, George Steiner in his book Real Presences makes a compelling counter-argument, which I would adapt very briefly as saying that the distance between the verba and res, the signifier and the signified, should properly be a moment for us to awaken to the reality of a being which is beyond our own mind, beyond the schemata of Immanuel Kant, the reality of a world created by God, what I call a stranger world. And it is historically the moral obligation of the human person to practice xenia, or hospitality to the stranger. That means we need to be open to the reality beyond our own mind. And of course, this is a way out of the Cartesian trap of modern philosophy. It is a way toward what I call the whole horse. I call it the whole horse. I'm stealing from another Southern writer, Alan Tate, who in 1930 was talking about the problem with the modern vision of the world. And he says that when most modern people look at a horse, they see one of a few things. They see either pure horsepower. The horse is an abstraction, horsepower, right? Or they see just materials, right? A horse can be turned into glue. Or they see a sort of sentimental object. What they don't see is integrity. They don't see the horse as a whole. They don't acknowledge or welcome the integritas of a being outside of their own minds. And so, in conclusion, what we're trying to do, I think, is provide technical knowledge, provide literary, historical, and aesthetic knowledge, and also lead young writers to an awareness of this presence beyond the self, a recognition that writing is not really about the writer. It's about contact with the transcendent reality whose attributes are goodness, beauty, and truth. So I think that's about 15 minutes, and I'll stop there. Right.
In what I have to say, I'll be, again, mostly unfolding things that have been said already, implications of things that have been shared, but I'm a little shorter than Ryan. I also have an advantage that I think nobody else on the panel does, in that I, before teaching in this program, came through it as a student. So I can speak a little bit to what it did for me directly, and the ways in which a lot of these ideas that we've been unpacking here are not mere abstractions, are not bloodless or unrelated to direct, immediate, practical experience of the creative effort, but for me have been nothing short of liberatory and transformative. So I want to start by talking about the sort of two different approaches that this tradition provides toward what it is the artist does, not just who the human person is, which I think the theological anthropology of the Christian tradition is deeply rooted in the ability to access either of these two strains of thought about the identity of the artist. But I think that both should be radically available to anyone, regardless of where they're from, who their parents were, what their education has been previous to engaging with these. They should be open to any person of goodwill who wants to engage with the best of what has been thought and said. So these two major approaches are to think of art as prophecy, right? To think of art as being open to something that wants to speak through you, something more than you could say on your own. And then the other approach is to think of and speak of art as craftsmanship, right? Mainly as a techne or a practice where you can learn the skills and you can internalize the disciplines. You can learn where a trochee goes in an iambic line. And you can build on these ways of doing, right? Have these practices that enable you to excel, right, on this level, and that this should be, again, radically accessible, as long as you have the material conditions to, practice and the time to practice, and that these things should not be as, I guess, as stringent as it can sometimes seem. Although, on the other hand, they're worth any amount of devotion that you can spare to give to them. You can see that either of these are humane, right? The third approach that I think I was exposed to quite a bit, even coming up in a Catholic institution, right, as an undergraduate interested in becoming a writer, was this approach that I want to call the sociological. I'm putting a question mark by that, because I don't want to engage with it as an exponent of the discipline of sociology necessarily, but just as a sort of way of approaching the act of writing that wants to put the writer, as Ryan was saying, into their sociological categories, right? And to say all that you can really say is a reflection of your own social positionality, right? It's radically bounded by this. You can't see outside of your lane. You can't speak outside of your lane. You have a lane, and we are going to tell you what it is, and we're going to put you in it, and that's where you're going to stay, right? This is, for obvious reasons, I think radically constraining, and not in the way that can be generative as the technical demands of craft can be generative, but can be an externally imposed a way of shutting down things before they can begin, right? And I think oftentimes what it really cashes out to is a kind of cognitive defense against beauty, and a cognitive defense against reality, right? And a defense against, ultimately, the insight that we are all radically equal in the eyes of God, right? That there is a human dignity that we're given that's not appropriated, that's not earned or self-made, but inherently received, right? So this approach of positionality is something that I had to unlearn, right? And the resources of the tradition gave me the ability to see that there is the possibility of accessing your creative practice, not as if you were merely a recording instrument for whatever happens to be out there, and not as if you were merely an exponent of some kind of class or social distinction, but as a child of God, right? As a human being with the ability to speak to questions of what it means to be human, and what it means to be creative, right? And I think I'm just going to cut short what I have to say because I want to leave time for conversation. But there's this sort of commonality here that can be found that it is something that our world desperately needs the ability to access across all of the other divisions that we experience. And I think that if we're going to communicate this well, we need to aspire to the creative coherence of the Magnificat, where Mary, this humble woman from a small village in the Middle East, nevertheless is able to be aware of her entire tradition, the tradition that has come before her, to encompass it, to take it into herself so profoundly that she's able to transform it and to incarnate it. That creative coherence of the Magnificat, I think, is the aspiration of this program. It's certainly my creative aspiration, and something to which I think we can all see the value. So.
So we do have time for some questions, if anyone has them. Way in the back there.
Thank you all. Lovely talks. I may get this wrong. I don't know. I think it was T.S. Eliot who said something like an artist captures something about his or her own age in a work of art. I'm wondering where that fits, maybe in your typology of the prophetic, the positional, and so on. It seems like it's something expressive. Like the artists may produce something that's actually not. It may not be beautiful, for instance, precisely because something about his or her own age is decadent, sort of falling pieces. I'm just wondering, I may be botching the Eliot flow, but this element of sort of bringing into oneself one's whole age and then sort of giving expression to it in a film or in a piece of fiction or something along those lines. I'm just wondering where that fits in the topology of sort of visions of imagination.
So Dietrich von Hildebrand talks about the aesthetic transposition of ugliness, right? And that is loud. The aesthetic transposition of ugliness is exactly what you're talking about here, with the ability to I have so much trouble with microphones. The ability to include what is unprepossessing, what is ugly, what is offensive, right, within a larger whole, right? And it is a question of knowing how to fit that proportionally to the entirety of experience, to recognize it as a part of experience, and in some sense, right, separated from, like, evil is a privation of reality, right, rather than a fulfillment of it, or a separate entity with equal powers. We're not dualists, right? We don't think that, there's sort of an evil, right? We're not Manichees, right? There's not an evil spirit and a good spirit that have equal power, and we just have to struggle for a balance, right? We're looking for real transcendence, which is the reign of God, ultimately, right? So to do that in practice, it's not easy. I don't think that's an easy thing at all. Yeah, and it's going to be a matter of the individual work and the context in which, into which you're speaking, and the particular circumstances of the the situation or the character that's being depicted, right? You have to be, on one hand, honest, right, about what is there to be observed, because otherwise no one is going to trust, right, that you've paid close enough attention to be able to speak about this. But on the other hand, there's a real risk of paying such close attention to all of the outrageous details and sort of wallowing in that outrage that you then become unable to escape that, right? Like the souls in the purgatory that are sort of stuck in these pools, right, of the filth that they then become sort of identified with, or immersed in a way that's irreversible, right? So you don't want to fall over here, and you also don't want to be so, you don't want to gloss over things. Yeah, it's a question of proportion is where I'll leave it, because we could just keep going.
If I could just say a footnote to that, which was wonderful. You think of someone like Balzac, the great French realist novelist who wrote over 90 works of fiction and the human comedy. I think that it would be a misunderstanding to read his work as a history of France, if that makes sense, right? But sometimes people do read his novels and reduce them to that kind of historical record. But of course, the historical record is also there. And so another example that I would give is that maybe to put it more generatively. Well, sorry, let me go back to Balzac. He's not just giving us a historical record. He's also probing into the problem, especially of human ambition, which trends. Last time I checked, human ambition is not relegated to 1830, right? And to use the example of Jane Austen's Persuasion, which we read in The Art of Metaphysics of Fiction before Infinite Jest, that novel begins with Sir Walter Elliot looking at, very pleased with his familial baronetage book, which is a sort of record of all of the great deeds and figures in his family line. He himself is not so great, but when he's feeling down, he opens up the baronetage and it makes him feel better. And there's two things that I would say about that. One is that, if we're thinking about how we would, obviously in a certain sense, there's no baronetage now, right? No, but people aren't cracking open their family trees in that same way, but people are checking their Facebook pages in an almost identical way, right? For very similar reasons when they're feeling down. So when I'm teaching students, again, how can you sort of extract, or to use another Eliot line, right? The great artist, I think I'm going to botch it, but so don't fact check me, NBC. But, the great artists steal rather than borrow. But what is that? That theft is a kind of carrying forward of the flame, not just like sort of letting it have the same shape. And so you're writing the contemporary Sir Walter Elliot, he's going to be looking at his Twitter feed or his Facebook rather than his baronetage, but human vanity is nonetheless satirized in both of those renderings, if that makes sense.
It's a sign of my Magnificat-like humility that I abstain from offering an answer on a question that raises T.S. Eliot. So there was a hand over here, and then we'll go to the one in the back.
So I recently came upon a prayer card for somebody whose cause has been considered for martyrdom. He was an Irish priest born in 1971, and he was ordained around 97. He went to Uganda and was killed there in about 2001. And the prayer card has a quotation from his first homily when I think he was ordained, which is in County Galway. And they knew where he was going, so this might shed light on our vocation generally and on the vocation of a writer. He said, "I go as your missionary. I bring with me what I've learned from my parish, from my parents, from my school, from my neighbours. Too, I bring all that with me to the people of Africa."
Beautiful, thank you. Way to the back.
Yes. Continuing a theme from Mr. Joya last night, and certainly a theme within Flannery O'Connor, it's the academic and the common man. How do you work to reconnect the poet, the academic, and the world of the common man?
Let me take that one.
Happily. So. Oh, you're going to take that. I thought you looked at me and said, "Would you take that one?"
No,
And
no,
I said,
let me say
"You go ahead."
you can do it too.
Who's more common?
Years ago, I'd just given a poetry reading at that Catholic University of America, and we were at dinner at Busboys and Poets afterwards, and I said to my host, "What a pity I didn't get to meet the poet Ryan Wilson while I was here." And I hear this creaking sound, and beside me, the bar stool next to me turns, and there is Ryan Wilson. So he's always just out of my peripheral vision. So thank you, Ryan. So that's actually one of the fundamental questions that we raised and tried to answer with our curriculum. I was thinking about this during the other James Wilson, who's speaking here, remarks yesterday in this room. And I am sorry to say this to all of the members of English departments across the world, but the world needs very little additional scholarship on literature. What it does need is people who know how to talk out of the eros, the love of literature, about why it's worth reading. The world always needed this. Criticism is a wonderful genre in every century. It needs it more than ever now in what is effectively a post-literate age, where a race, a civilization that has understood the act of reading as fundamental to forming yourself for 2,000, 3,000 years. Even the illiterate are still nonetheless formed by things read, hence in a Benedictine monastery, the reading of spiritual texts during meals, etc. No longer understands why a book is a thing you might even look at. So we, here's the marketing part of this. In most other MFA programs, a student would come and take a workshop with the artist and learn the craft. And then that same student would be farmed out to a seminar in a that's really aimed at PhD students and would be taught to study something like feminism, feminist themes, and Reformation literature. You cannot bring anything you might learn in that room back to your art without ruining your art. So it's actually harmful to take those seminars. So I'm not mincing any words here. So we have designed our seminars as for writers and by writers so that each of our students will not only learn to master their craft as poets, as fiction writers, but they also learn how to speak about literature in a compelling way and in different occasions. What the world needs is good book reviews. Yeah. What the world needs is good essays like the ones that were being recited next door on why you should read Sigrid Undset, why you should read Muriel Spark. I hope you don't regret coming to this one just because I just said this was a good panel next door. But
could I just really quickly?
Yeah,
there's
go
something I think that's important to add to that. On the one hand, I think our program and our vision for what literary culture should do for our world beyond our program is very much rooted in this sense of, instead of writing academic papers for any of our classes, students, insofar as they do write nonfiction, are learning the art of the essay, and specifically learning how to write in a way that your Aunt Dymphna or your Aunt Lidwina, who are not really serious readers or don't know what literature is and maybe don't love it, don't understand it, and are intimidated by it, to convince them to fall in love with it. On the other, there's a flip side, though, that's really important to articulate, which is, Flannery O'Connor said that art is not democratic. Art, we should not treat in the same manner. To write so that you're writing towards an audience of people who don't normally read. I think it was my friend Trevor Cribben-Merrill who told me that, at one point Jane Austen's novels were selling something like 750 copies, right? And I remember that George Eliot's non-husband said very exhilaratingly that one of her novels had sold 1,500 copies, right? So one of the things that I think we need to get away from is sort of in mass culture, where the measurement of the success of a literary work is that it's, now we have like these mass market paperback versions of Jane Austen that are selling in the millions, but that sort of obfuscates the origins of these works, which is that only a very small number of people were reading and appreciating them. And one of the reasons for that is that art is not democratic. And what Flannery means by that is that it makes demands of the reader that most readers are not willing to make on themselves. But we absolutely should continue to make art that makes demands on the readers and nothing else. We might as well give up if not.
We are out of time, but if Dave Griffith and Rhonda Ortiz would come to the front, we will happily engage you in conversation afterwards. The rest of you go get a cup of coffee. Thank you for coming.